Hi everyone, welcome back to Richmond Public Library Presents Young Writers Workshop. I'm Mr. Lewis from the Ginter Park Library. Today we are going to be talking about literary tropes and devices. I briefly mentioned literary tropes in the last video. Well, today we're going to start talking about them. In fact, this is actually such a big topic that I'm actually going to split this video into two parts. I have a whole long list, so this video is going to be the first half of that list, and the next video next month will be the remaining part of it. There's a lot to get into. All right, so here's the list we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about allegory, metaphors and similes. I'm lumping them together because they are very similar. Anthropomorphism and personification. Difficult things to say, not that difficult to do. Irony, dramatic irony, which is not the same as regular irony. Framing devices, foreshadowing, in medias res, which is a fun thing to say. Flashback, onomatopoeia, which is an awesome word just in general, and oxymoron, which sounds like an insult but is not. So, there's a lot to get into. Let's get started. So, the first trope we're going to talk about is allegory. If you've never heard of allegory, it is basically when your story is meant to represent something else. Now, this can be very specific or could be kind of vague depending on how you're presenting your story. Sometimes you have grand ideas or whole concepts that are represented in your story by a character or a place. But sometimes it's a lot more specific. Like this character in your book is meant to represent a real life character, a real life person. They're called something else, but it's clear from the context of the story that this made up character is meant to represent this real life person. Okay? Now, allegory can be used for a couple of things. One of the most common is to impart a moral. All right, basically to teach you a lesson. A very, very famous example of this is Aesop's fables. Fables are stories that usually involve animals or inanimate objects that act as if they were people, and they go through a situation where their negative actions have negative consequences, or their positive actions have positive consequences. All right. And those stories where the animal or the person or the thing does whatever it is negative or positive action, they get that negative or positive consequence. That is meant to represent how if you as a person in real life do these negative or positive things, you will have either negative or positive results. All right. So it's meant to teach a moral, to kind of teach a lesson, to help you be a better person, is the general concept. All right. You can also do this to explain something. Maybe if you have a very, very complex thing, you can use a story to make it a lot simpler. All right, a very famous example of this is George Orwell's Animal Farm. Now, this might be something that the younger viewers have never heard before, but if there's anyone here who's in high school, you probably have heard of this, if not read it yourselves. It's a very common story, and it's meant to represent actual political issues. And it's very clearly done in a way that is understandable to the reader, but it reflects very real and very complex political issues. An Animal Farm is about animals. Literally, it's animals who take over a farm. But it very clearly is meant to represent a much larger issue. All right. So the majority of allegory is, like I said, folktales or fables, all right, to impart the moral, to explain something. But you actually can and do have quite large and quite important stories out there that are purely allegory. Next up, we're going to talk about metaphors and similes. Now, these are literary devices which are very more specific than tropes. Tropes are more general, whereas devices are more specific. So metaphors and similes are devices that authors will use to make comparisons. All right, so they are both a form of comparison. But there is one very important difference, and it's simple, but it is important. All right, metaphors are comparisons between two things without using the word like or as. All right, so it's a comparison between two things without using like or as. So some examples: all the world's a stage. All right, maybe you've heard that before. All right, you're comparing the world to a stage. All right, it was music to my ears. All right, so something that is being heard, something that you hear, is being compared to music. all right, even if it's not music, all right. I've never heard anyone describe a song or music in general as music to my ears, because obviously, right? So you only would say it was music to my ears if it's something that's not music. So you're making that comparison in order to give a point. Okay? So comparing two things without using those words like or as. So of course, similes are comparisons between two things that do use the word like or as. So cold as ice, run like the wind. All right. So it's a direct comparison. All right. Metaphors are usually a little more vague, a little less specific, whereas similes are, this is it. This is a direct comparison. Cold as ice, run like the wind, right? Hard as brick, whatever it is. All right. You're using those words like and as cause a direct comparison between two things, whereas metaphors make that comparison a little less obvious. All right. You're still doing that comparison. You're still making a comparison, but it's not quite as obvious. Okay. And you can use these all the time. People use them all the time, even if they don't know that they're using them. All right. But it is important not to confuse the two things. All right. Metaphors, like I said, are more vague. Similes are more specific. All right. A lot of people try to say that a metaphor is just any comparison between two things, but that is not true. All right. That like or as are very important in distinguishing between a metaphor and a simile. Okay. All right. So let's talk about anthropomorphism and personification. They might seem difficult, but in reality, they're actually fairly simple once you understand what they are. They both deal with making non-human things seem or act human. Okay, so anthropomorphism is when we give human characteristics to non-human beings. So when an animal or an object is shown to act quite literally like a human being. All right. In this way, anthropomorphism is much more literal than personification, which will make more sense in a bit. All right, but it's any story where animals or objects act like humans. That's an example of anthropomorphism. Okay, and when we say act like humans, you don't just mean like they pretend to be humans. All right, like a bird that can mimic the way a person talks. We mean animals are presented as if they were human. All right, so some examples of this would be Cat in the Hat. All right, Cat in the Hat is an example of anthropomorphism because the cat acts like a human, right? Walks, talks, wears a hat, wears gloves, has a little bow tie. Cats don't do that. All right, he's acting more like a person would act than a cat would act. That is anthropomorphism. Zootopia is a great example, right? If you haven't seen the movie Zootopia, it's about a society where animals basically have the same kind of lives that humans do now, with all the kind of issues that come with that. But they have clothes, they have distinct languages and societies, they have technology, they drive cars. All right, these are all things that animals can't do, right? So we give them those human characteristics. All right. And cars is one of the rare examples of objects that are given human characteristics. All right, it's not as common as with the animals, but it does happen. So cars in the movie Cars and its sequels, the cars act like humans, right? They talk, sometimes they have clothes, they have their own buildings, they have their own society. They are, for all intents and purposes, people, but they are still cars, right? They are non-living objects that in this story act like living objects. All right. There are literally hundreds of examples of this. But anthropomorphism basically is something that is more broad, more general. Usually it's something that happens throughout a story, or at least for a large portion of the story. And it's something that is not done as a comparison, but it's just a way that a character or characters are, just the way they are. All right. Personification, though, is a little bit different. Personification is attributing human-like behavior to non-human things. Now, this might sound exactly the same as anthropomorphism, but it's not. Personification is more specific. It's usually a comparison. It's what we call metaphorical. All right, we just learned what a metaphor is. It's a comparison, right? And we do not use the words like or as, which is why it's metaphorical and not a simile. But personification is when we compare, in a moment usually, a non-human thing to a human in some way or form. All right. Usually it's an action, but it can sometimes just be like a way of being. So here are some examples. The pie was calling my name. All right. That's an expression that we would say. This, whatever it is, usually food, is calling my name. All right. Obviously, it's not literally calling their name. Pie can't talk. But that is an expression that means that I want that pie. All right. So the pie was calling my name. The light stabbed my eyes. Light can't physically harm you, right? Light cannot stab anything, but we still say light stabbed my eyes. We're giving it an action that it can't actually do to get the point across. My computer hates me. Computers can't hate, right? They don't have emotions. They're not alive. They cannot feel hate. But we say things like this if something isn't working out, if a computer's not working. We say expressions like this to kind of give you an idea of how we feel or what is going on. All right? Pie was calling my name. I'm hungry for that pie. The light stabbed my eyes. The light was very bright. My computer hates me. Something's not working. All right? So we use personification as a way to make comparisons or to better get across a certain emotion that a character is having. Okay? So now let's talk about irony. Irony is a fairly simple concept, even if it sounds complicated when I explain it. Basically, irony is when contradictory words or situations lead to outcomes that are different from what is expected. Basically, when you expect something to happen and something completely different happens. All right, usually that's from a situation or from what is being said, which leads me to this. There are two kinds of irony. There's verbal irony and situational irony. Right? Verbal irony is all about saying the opposite of what you mean. It's kind of like sarcasm, but it's a lot less mean-spirited. When we think something sarcastic, we think of something being mean. Like somebody asks, "Are you upset?" And you go, "No, I'm not upset." That's sarcastic, right? And it's rather mean-spirited, right? Verbal irony is usually a lot less mean-spirited. So it's like walking into an empty room and saying, "Sure is crowded in here." Or if it's really nasty weather outside and said, "Oh, it's a beautiful day we're having," right? Or if you ask for answers like in a classroom or something and nobody answers and you say, "Well, don't all talk at once." That is verbal irony, all right? It sounds a lot like sarcasm, but it's all in the intention. Sarcasm is meant to be mean or rude in some way, but irony is more about trying to get your point across usually in a comedic way, right? Situational irony is all about reversing expectations in a situation. All right. So you have an activity that is going on and you expect it to go a certain way because that's just the way these things normally go. And then something completely opposite happens. A lot of times this is used, again, for comedy. So an example would be if you just washed your car and then it starts to rain. That's situational irony. All right. Or you see a fire station that's on fire. Situational irony. Right? A dentist who has to get a root canal done, something like that. Situational irony is all about taking what you expect to happen and flipping it on its head in some way. Again, normally for comedy, but really can just be to kickstart a plot, to have an event happen. It can sometimes be used for suspense, sometimes it can be used for character development. There's a lot of different uses for irony, but it is very common. So just be aware of that when you're writing your own story. So now let's talk about dramatic irony, which is not exactly like regular irony. This is a very specific kind of irony, all right? And this is where the reader of a story knows something that the characters in that story do not know. All right. This is often used for suspense or for comedy. So there's a situation where the reader knows more than the characters, which gives us a sense of either suspense or it adds amusement to it because we know something that they don't know. All right. So it might be easier just to give some examples with this one. So, for example, in the movie Mulan, we, the audience, know that Mulan is a woman. Throughout the entire movie. We know that from the beginning. That's not a secret to us. But the other characters in the movie do not. right? The whole point is that she's pretending to be a man in order to fight in the Chinese army. So that is an example of dramatic irony, where the expectation of what can happen at any moment is there. All right, it's used for comedic purposes and sometimes used for suspenseful purposes. It's, will she be found out, right? But there's a lot of actual jokes that go along with it. So depending on how this dramatic irony is used, you can either add suspense or you can add comedy. All right. Another very common example is we, the reader, usually know superheroes as secret identities. All right. If you read comics at all, there are very, very, very few superheroes where we, the reader, do not know who the superhero's secret identities are. All right. So if, say, for example, one of the most famous ones is, of course, Batman. Batman is Bruce Wayne in most of the comics. So if we see a situation where someone is talking to Bruce Wayne about how much they dislike Batman, that is dramatic irony, because we know that that really is Batman that he's talking to, even though he, the character, does not know that. All right, that's dramatic irony. A good example for suspense would be if there's a horror movie or any horror story in general where we know that the bad guy or the monster is nearby, but the characters don't. All right, that is very common. Right. In fact, a lot of the elements of a good horror, the scares, the suspense, the thrills, those all come from dramatic irony because we know that there is a danger that the characters do not know. All right. So that actually is going to about wrap it up for this video. I know there are 6 more things on that list, but we will cover them next month. This video is already a lot longer than I originally intended it to be. So I hope you all found this useful, and I hope that you stick around and learn about the rest of the next month. All right? So however you use these, whatever you decide to write, just write. Thank you all so much for joining me, and I'll see you all next time.